Welcome to Freethinking 101, a course unlike any you have taken before. We challenge you to examine your beliefs, values, judgments, your mindset, your biases and prejudices, your religion, your philosophy. In short, to examine the recesses of your mind and defend the cobwebs you store in that belfry. Freethinking 101 is brought to you by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. Tonight we're having the second session on the topic Jesus Christ, Fact or Fiction. There has been an ongoing debate, seldom heard by the general public, concerning the most central tenet of Christian belief, the existence of Jesus as a historical figure. Did Jesus really live? Are the stories that occurred at that time fact? To shed light on this again is Pat Inniss, the president of the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. He's going to start by giving us a brief capsulation of what was covered in our last session. Pat.
Oh, thank you, Steve. Yeah, well, I guess as a source of a lot of the information I used, there was a good book I'd like to recommend to the viewers by G.A. Wells. And what Mr. Wells has done was to really go back through a lot of the literature that's out there, the research that's being done by a lot of the historians, and bring it all together for you and write it, present it in terms that most people can understand. You don't have to be a historian, a biblical scholar. You don't have to read Greek or...
don't have to be a PhD.
Exactly. If I can read it, that pretty much guarantees that. But Mr. Wells is a professor of German at a university in London, and he's really an authority on German intellectual history. And this really serves him well for this project, because a lot of the most progressive research concerning the Bible has been done by German scholars. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, dates back to the 19th century when a lot of the work was done. But they're considered some of the people that have really broken a lot of new ground in considering what the Bible really means, what its place is in literature and history. And they've, of course, the Germans were also great archaeologists and did a lot of work in the Middle East in the study of archaeology. But they have a very rich history of study of the Bible, and it's interesting.
They're pretty good at it.
They're good at it, yeah. Did I get that point across?
Yeah. Yep.
But even among the Germans and some British scholars, people have actually had their professions ruined by, not in the last few years, but historically have had their professions ruined by challenging this concept that Jesus was a historical figure, somebody that was actually existed. Mm-hmm. And when you consider the question, of course, whether Jesus was a historical figure, you have to ask yourself, well, was he, what is the definition of Jesus? Are you saying this is the person that walked across water, this is the person that raised from the dead, this is the person that actually himself raised himself from the dead and ascended into heaven? If you ask yourself that question, whether these things happened, you can sort of, I think, say, no, this person didn't exist. But to what extent did somebody exist that was a real person out there? And how much evidence is in the Bible to support whatever notions you may have along those lines?
And you're going to tell us all about that
eventually
tonight.
I'm going to get to that, yes. Well, what we covered in the last show, I guess, quite a bit of ground, not enough to really do justice to the subject. As you know, there's the entire New Testament, really, you could, virtually the whole thing you could refer to argue this point back and forth, and that's a lot of literature to deal with. One of the best things to do, though, when you're involved in this sort of research, is to go to the outside source, the non-biblical sources, and see if there's any reference to that. And like we said in the last show, it's pretty scanty. I think people point to two things that bear references to Christians: Tacitus, that was about 120 A.D., and Josephus in about 93 A.D. And the argument is, well, some people that are trying to say that Jesus really lived as a real person will say that yes, these mentions validate the biblical accounts.
Yeah.
And the counter argument is, well, these people are just mentioning what the belief is of the Christians or what the folklore is. And it really doesn't prove anything. But perhaps a more fruitful line is to investigate the real veracity of the Bible, how good a source of information is the Bible about historical fact. And when you look at that, you come up with the impression that the Gospels really aren't very reliable because of several factors. One of them is that the Gospels were not really written at the time that Jesus lived, although they report a lot of verbatim speeches, parables by Jesus. A lot of words are put in Jesus' mouth. The truth is that the Gospels were written from about 66 A.D. to about 100 A.D. Mm-hmm. So these were all written well after Jesus was dead, even if you accept the account that he was born in the year 4, and was it 4 A.D. or B.C.? I always get confused on that. And died in 33 years later. Now, there's also a very definite lineage to the Bible that you can trace back. The earliest Bible is I keep confusing Bible and gospel, if you pardon me. The
earliest gospel.
Earliest gospel is what I'm trying to say, is generally thought to be the Gospel of Mark. Okay, now here at this point, I again ought to interject the fact we call these Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they weren't actually written by these saints, these evangelists. These Gospels were written after these guys were probably already dead. Okay, from at the earliest 66 and at the latest about 100. Fudge that either way. But Mark was the earliest gospel, so-called Mark gospel. And Matthew and Luke were plagiarizations of Mark with various spins added, depending on whatever the particular religious theological perspective that the author happened to have. So Matthew and Luke came after Mark. They essentially rewrote Mark with a little different light. And then you have, of course, the Gospel of John, which is from a somewhat different tradition. And, a lot of people, I guess it's generally accepted that John has sort of a Greek influence. But you can sort of date the writings of the Gospels by, say, looking at certain incidents that are reported in the Gospels that can be verified historically. I guess one of the primary milestones they use to date the Gospel is the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred, one of the destructions of Jerusalem, which occurred at 70 A.D., which is found in Luke. He rewrote Mark 13 to include that. Big event, you shouldn't leave it out.
Added it on,
Yeah, but he very carefully explained that although, there was this event, it wouldn't mean the end of although Jerusalem would be destroyed, it wouldn't mean the end of the universe, because by the time this gospel was written, Jerusalem had been destroyed, and surprise of surprises, the universe, nothing great happened. So they knew at that time that they couldn't, they better not make they could continue predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, but they had to sort of modify it to make sure that they said, oh yeah, by the way, this does not mean that the world
demise of the world
will come to an end, as somebody may have said before. We don't know who said that, but there's been a rumor going around. But you study these things, and biblical scholars have looked into this, and they can date the Bible fairly accurately. So the perception that there were people following Jesus around with
taking notes
was is somewhat inaccurate. But when we're kids, you're in school. This. Well, when I was a kid, I thought Henry Ford invented the automobile. Okay, and it's very easy the way things are presented to to accept this and really not know some very important distinctions in history that make all the difference in the world. And the fact that the Gospels were written a number of years after the death of this character Jesus, even assuming he lived in the time span that he did, is very important.
If the Gospels, as you're saying, don't seem to be all that reliable, what about the epistles? Many people view St. Paul as the person who really popularized Christianity. Surely he had something convincing to say about Jesus.
Yeah. Well, St. Paul is a very interesting character, and in some sense you can, if you really just look at it chronologically, the epistles of St. Paul represent a better view, perhaps a more accurate view of Jesus than what you find in the Gospels, simply because his accounts were written earlier. And
closer to the event.
Right. Now, we have a pretty good idea that Paul actually wrote a lot of this stuff, So that's an advantage right there.
That's confirmed?
Well, all this stuff is, there's a strong conjectural,
Yeah, but there's stronger evidence for that at any rate.
Very strong evidence. Well, particularly, not a lot of them are attributed to St. Paul, the epistles, but not all of them. But the ones that they think are very likely written by St. Paul, I'll say generally accepted as being written by St. Paul, are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, 1st Colossians, and maybe Colossians, okay? So that still leaves a lot of stuff out there that they say was written by St. Paul, but probably wasn't. But if you look at those, and say, accept that those are written by St. Paul, then you've got a pretty good, well, one thing is it's a very distinct, the message there is very distinct from what you find in the Gospels, because this is, I guess, something we mentioned in the previous program, but it's important to note that since you can date the Gospels, you can at least establish an order of the Gospels. You know that one has obviously been copied from the other, so it must have been written sometime after it. You've established that the epistles were written before the Gospels, but as you go along, as you progress through time, you don't find the picture that's presented of Jesus becoming less detailed as he becomes a fainter memory in time. You find more details appearing in the later accounts in the Bible of the life of Jesus. So it's interesting that what people are actually doing is they're layering things on as they rewrite these stories, like we said about the destruction of Jerusalem, and putting in added details as you find them out. But when you look at St. Paul, the thing that characterizes him is a sort of, in a way, almost a fuzzy view of Jesus, because there aren't a lot of details in there that are present in the later works, in the Gospels.
Right.
And the thing about St. Paul is, he's a pretty weird guy. Okay, he's got people generally seem to recognize that he's sort of a notorious character, I guess, in Christianity. But he's one of the reasons for this is he's very mystical. And in Galatians, he stresses that his accounts are not attributable to human authority, but rather to direct revelation. I mean, what he's saying is people are receiving transmissions directly from God on high, and that's what he's basing his accounts on. He's saying that that these revelations, hallucinations quite probably, are really what he relies on for his accounts more than eyewitness accounts or somebody actually saying they were there. What he's relying on is people's thoughts or hallucinations, dreams, revelations, whatever you want to call them. And that's where Paul's coming from. He's a mystic.
Yeah.
To him, this is authority. He's not a historian. He's not a scientist. He is a mystic, and the religious beliefs are very, very strong with Paul. But this is something you have to really consider when you're evaluating whether this is really a good historical account that you're reading, or whether it's just somebody's hallucinatory recollections.
Right.
So when you compare the Gospels and the epistles side by side, they're really not very mutually reinforcing.
They're not really telling the same story.
Yeah, exactly. There's what you get is, it's, the story that St. Paul tells is really sort of vague. So you're left with the impression that maybe he's not dealing with the same type of real, right now character that comes across in the Bible. There's really perhaps a feeling that Jesus is sort of displaced in time from Paul. I guess traditionally is, they've really set down to the month and even the day. They try to tell you that Jesus was born and when he died, but you don't find that in Paul. A lot of the things that they use to date the existence of Jesus are not really mentioned in Paul, and Paul is the earliest account. So it all really sort of makes you wonder. In Paul, they don't mention John the Baptist. Okay, he's a very important character.
Yeah.
Why isn't he mentioned? The trial before the Roman officials isn't mentioned in Paul's work. Now this is something else that helps you identify where Jesus lived, and he doesn't even tell us where Jesus was born or where he died. Now he does mention Peter, which is at least one of the Jesus' associates that does come up, or alleged associates that comes up.
Yeah.
But he doesn't mention the fact that Peter denied Jesus. Now, what could be more important than that? I mean, that's very central to the whole story in the Gospels, but it's not even mentioned in Paul. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even really say that Peter knew Jesus firsthand.
Yeah.
So what you're left with is, a really vague picture of Jesus, and you're left wondering, when did this guy really live? Is it possible that Paul came upon this whole phenomenon of Christianity after it was already well in motion, a very small sect of people, and actually took it and picked it up and promoted it and made it into what it is? I mean,
took it and ran with it.
Perhaps that's what happened.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that, additionally, I might add that makes you wonder is like the miracles. Jesus performed supposedly many miracles, and this was one of the great things that he used to demonstrate the fact that he was the Messiah.
Yeah.
Of course, he couldn't work miracles. If you went to a place where the people didn't have faith, I can't remember the exact place in the Bible that says that, but that seemed like it was an incident where the people were lacking faith and he couldn't work the miracles. So that raises a whole lot of theological questions about the limitations of Jesus, and therefore the limitations of God, if you accept this.
There were skeptics in the audience.
Yeah, there's skeptics in the audience, a familiar refrain, I guess.
Yeah.
But these things are not mentioned by St. Paul. Why not? You have to wonder. But so St. Paul is a very, very good source of information, but rather puzzling.
Where does all of this leave modern scholarly views of Jesus? In other words, what do modern scholars think as a result of these kinds of contradictions and problems?
Well, it's funny. It's a problem really of when you talk about scholars in biblical scholarship, it's hard to separate out the people that aren't influenced by religionism and the people that are really approaching it from a rational, logical perspective. You'll pick up a book off the shelf at the library and you don't know what you're getting. Is it somebody that's trying to sell you religion, or is it somebody that's trying to tell you history?
Yeah.
And that's a problem, but in a way it's not a problem, because as far as they go, a lot of the Christian scholars, a lot of the Jewish scholars are very honest in their study of history, of the facts as we know them, as archaeologists, as biblical scholars, students of the literature. So a lot of the evidence that really impugns the existence of Jesus as a historical character, or at least undermines the evidence which has been put forth to bolster the argument that he did exist as a historical character. A lot of it has been provided by very honest Christian scholars. Now, at some point, they will say, well, even though there are these contradictions, these missing facts that we can't explain, like the fact that, these people that wrote the gospel and are supposedly telling us this, very accurate rendition of Jesus' life, don't know anything about Jewish culture. Say the example of Jesus, I guess in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is quoting the Greek rather than the Hebrew version of the book of Isaiah. Now, this would be unpardonable for Jesus to be talking to scholars of in the Hebrew tradition and to quote them the Greek version of Isaiah, which would totally undermine his standing, his reputation, or and mark him as a person that knew nothing himself about Hebrew culture. Yet, these are very, very small points. You might say, well, we're nitpicking, but these are things which, are very important in people's daily lives. And Christians will pick up the Bible, they'll read from it, and some of them will make very important decisions based on the content of this book, all the time believing what they're reading is an accurate retelling of true stories, things that really happened, of history. You can buy, a friend of mine bought one of these big charts that charted history.
Oh, yeah.
From it had a timeline that started in about 4000 BC or something like that. He sent, he ordered this thing out from an ad in the back of a science magazine. He thought he was getting, something worthwhile, and here it is, here's a biblical account of history. So people are out, there's a lot of confusion abroad about what actually represents history.
Maybe it was a creation science chart.
Creation, that's about all it was.
They start about that time.
It's about all it was good for. But lately, a lot of the study of this whole phenomenon has fallen to people like folklorists and archaeologists who are really interested in tying this together and really, trying to figure out what the meaning of all this is, in the sense that this is part of our cultural tradition. This is part of our literary tradition. The Bible is, important literature. There's some, argument over whether it's great literature or not, but, wars have been fought over it, and numerous people have died over it, and it continues to influence a lot of people. So it's very important that we discover it, but it's important that we put, characters like Jesus into the proper historical perspective and really, understand what the issues are here, and what's the truth, and what's the folklore, what's the mythology.
Maybe in the next few minutes you can tell us a little bit about the Shroud of Turin, because I understand that was one attempt for some people to understand the historicity of Jesus. Yeah,
well, the Shroud of Turin is sort of a very interesting controversy that swirled for quite a number of years. They thought, of course, I guess you can trace the history back to the 14th century. Now, when you realize, when you study history at that point, you realize that there was a very big industry in the production of fake relics, and it's sort of funny that that it should show up at that point. But that's the earliest evidence of the existence of this shroud. Supposedly, it was created at the death, at the time that Jesus died, and yet the earliest mention of it in history is in the 14th century, and I think the story goes that it was brought back from Constantinople during one of the Crusades as part of the booty that was obtained there when they raided the city. But recently, you can pick up certain books written from a sort of a more conservative perspective, and they will tout the Shroud of Turin as being one of the evidences of Christ's life. But recent dating, using the most advanced scientific techniques, have really proved that the Shroud of Turin was probably, about, say, I think the consensus was about 728 years old. Yeah. So it really, in that case, the dating techniques and the history that is known of the Shroud have come together to confirm each other.
Yeah.
and sort of put this whole issue to rest once and for all.
I understand that in the 14th century that it was unmasked as a fraud at that time, and there is historical record of that.
There is.
But I think there was a vested interest in keeping it alive. And
well, it was put away for quite a while when they knew it was a fraud, but, you know, it was dug up recently, and, you know, this probably isn't the last we've heard of it.
Yeah. I heard a program after it was determined by the dating process that it was about 14th century, 13th or 14th century. There was a program on the radio, and there were still a couple of individuals that were still claiming that it was real, and in spite of evidence to the contrary.
Well, I think that what they say is that when Jesus died, he gave off some burst of radiation,
Right.
which somehow made the results of this testing technique invalid.
Yeah.
Convenient.
Sounds more like that idea that there's a skeptic present or some kind of rationale for why this sort of thing doesn't work out. I attended a conference just recently, a convention, and one of the major writers in this area of the shroud was at the convention, a man named Joe Nickel. He's written several books on this, and his view is from the skeptic's vantage point, and he predicted that the dating would be as it turned out to be, and that's the way it worked.
We were all so surprised, weren't we?
Oh, weren't we?
I was startled.
Yeah. Are there any other things you'd like to throw in to wind up the program?
Well, just one thing, you know, returning back to the shroud again, it's such an interesting area, but, you know, one contradiction that maybe hasn't been brought to light really about the shroud is, you know, it's just sort of an interesting point, is that there was prohibitions in the Bible against graven images that were very rigidly observed by the Jews and by many early Christians, and well, some people still do observe the prohibitions against graven images. Why would this image of the shroud ever be produced?
Or be accepted.
Yes, if Jesus was God and there were to be no images of God produced. Right. So.
Well, Pat, I want to thank you very much for talking to us again and winding up these 2 sessions on the historicity of Jesus. I think there'll be a lot more conjecture on it. Freethinking 101 is brought to you by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. You can reach us by writing Box 2931, St. Louis, Missouri 63130. We would like to hear from you, your comments and suggestions for topics to discuss, or comments about programs we've presented. Watch for our next program. Thank you.